The session is the secrets of successful enterprise social computing. So if that's not the session you thought you were coming to, now is your opportunity to leave in front of the camera going, excuse me, you stay where you are. My name's Symon Garfield. My job is I work as the CTO for a Microsoft Gold partner based just outside London. We focus very heavily on doing SharePoint projects. I don't do anything technical these days. Last time I wrote a line of code, it was VB6 in 2005. So if anybody's got any VB6 apps that they want looking at, maybe I could be your man, see me afterwards. My role really is all about linking the use of technology back to business value. So making all of this really cool stuff that we've got in SharePoint actually deliver some sort of, hopefully, measurable results for businesses. So I help organizations define what their challenges are, envisage and come up with solutions, implement the solutions, and hopefully, and importantly at the end, actually measure the benefits that they get from them. As you would expect in a session about social computing, you can find me on the internet. Unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not quite sure which, I appear to be the only person in the world called Symon Garfield who spells their name S-Y-M-O-N. So everything that you find on Google is quite probably me. Okay, unless it's really bad, and then there's a disclaimer in there. So you'll find me on LinkedIn, you'll find me on Twitter, @Symon_Garfield. If you want to know what I've been reading, lots of the research that I've used for this session all gets bookmarked on Delicious. I've got a blog, but I have to be honest, I'm really appalling at keeping it up to date. I sit and think about things too much and never actually get a great deal written, but I will make an effort to get the notes from this session up on the blog. Why am I here, apart from the philosophical question? Many of you might be familiar with this. This is something that industry analysts, Gartner, use. It's their hype cycle, and they use it to track emerging technologies. And this is one that's been focused on social computing. And you can see that you've got social software suites. There's a few on there that would cover off SharePoint, I mean social bookmarking, for instance. But social software suites seems to be the one which, for me, really hits the note with SharePoint 2010. And as you can see, the way that Gartner classify these things is they talk about technology trigger, peak of inflected expectations. Currently, social suites are in the trough of disillusionment. Okay, so lots of hype, but lots of people getting disillusioned about things. But don't worry, because hopefully this session will all start on the slope of enlightenment, and then we'll end up on the plateau of productivity. There is another reason why I'm here. If I use something from personal experience, I was in a meeting just about 2 weeks ago. Got called into a meeting. I won't name them, but it's one of the UK's leading banks, a huge organisation. And they've had an idea to do what they call a colleague portal. Okay, well, not my site, yeah, that could work. And the idea is that they've got 2 different telephone directories for 60,000 people in their organisation. So they're going to do a 5,000 user pilot based around SharePoint 2010 My Sites. And one of the things they want to do is just so people can find each other. Okay, now if you think about the licenses for SharePoint, that could be an expensive way just to find each other. So I sat in a room with 15 people to get this project started, and every single one of them was an IT infrastructure architect of some description, all techie people. And there had been some requirements, or talk of requirements at the beginning. Somebody had a slide deck somewhere, but nobody actually referred back to what it was that they were trying to achieve. And halfway through the meeting, I said, what are you actually trying to do? And the guy that was the business leader from the organisation said, I'm not too sure. I said, well, how will you know when you've done it? He said, well, I'm not too sure. But anyway, we want to start deploying some servers in April. And I said, okay. The next day, I was introduced to the business requirements owner in a telephone conference, and she worked on the SharePoint infrastructure team. So I'm a little bit suspicious as to whether or not that project will work. Oh, the other thing to tell you actually on that is they've got 60,000 people, and during the course of the conversation, it turns out that they've actually got 44,000 My Sites already deployed on their MOS platform. So I said, well, how is this going to get any better? Well, it's new, isn't it? It's the upgrade. It's SharePoint 2010. It's got loads of new features. So I'm a little bit suspicious as to whether that project will go well, but we'll try hard. So that's why I'm here, to try and get around those sorts of problems. This is what I'm going to talk about. Bit of context, why are we talking about social computing, or enterprise social computing anyway. And then I've used this framework, strategy, governance, architecture, and transition. I've used it as the basis for the sessions that I've done the last 2 years at this conference. And I tried really hard to make this one different, but it just works. So the content is all different for anybody who remembers those sessions, but I've used the same framework to kind of structure my thoughts. Speaking of structuring thoughts, I'm not going to go through all of these. You know, people get the slides afterwards, but we hear lots of terms being thrown around. You know, social computing, Web 2.0, social media, social networking, collaboration, and they kind of all get munged in together. So one of my favourite cliches, as you can see, is words are the units that we use to structure our thoughts. So it's actually a good idea just to kind of focus in on the words that we're using, because it helps us understand what we're trying to do. The main thing really is I'm talking about social computing, and as I've picked out there in bold, it is the general umbrella term that encompasses all of the other terms that you see there. One other point that I'll make off this slide, and that's don't confuse social networking with collaboration. They're very different things. A network, people have connections to each other. Collaboration is all about we're trying to achieve the same thing. So networking enables collaboration, but they are very different. Okay, so why are we talking about enterprise social computing anyway? In a word, Facebook. Now, it's not that simple, of course, but I won't even bother to ask because the statistics show that at least half of you in the room are probably going to be on Facebook. I should imagine that there's quite a few of you tweeting and Facebooking at the moment. Let's just put it into context then. So 2 billion people, approximately, in the world have internet access at the moment, and around about a quarter of them, 600 million, have active Facebook accounts. There's 100 million LinkedIn accounts, around about 70 million Twitter accounts, and this is an important one for me. Employees of all ages spend up to 70 hours a week. I don't have a country next to that, so I'm assuming it's UK-based, but spend up to 70 hours a week in front of laptops and smartphones. So there's two things that go together, really. It's the mobile devices and it's the social networking, and I think that the two together is a really, really powerful force. Some of you may have seen this. It's some research that's been done by some students, and they've gathered all of the data about Facebook adoption. So this map here shows, you know, the grey areas. The greyer the area, the higher the percentage in terms of population that actually use Facebook. So the point is that, as you can see, we're going from America down to Australia and the whole of Europe and the UK and Ireland and all the rest of it. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. You've got the adoption trends here. So it actually went public around about 2007, then became available in various different languages. So you can see the adoption curve going up here to around about 600 million. In the States, 128 million users on Facebook, which represents around about 42% of the population. In the UK, 27 million, around about 45% of the population. And you can see here, the bar graphs there, that's actually showing you the age distribution. So the one nearest to me are the under 18s, and then I think that it goes from 18 to 25, from 26 to 35, from 36 to 45, and the smaller ones, I think, are the above 55s. So I think you can see that you've actually got a good demographic range. People all the way really from 18 through to around about 55 are using this kind of technology. But 55 million updates on Facebook every week, apparently, pieces of content. But it's the old 80-20 rule. 80% of the content is posted by 20% of the people. With Twitter, even though there's 70 million accounts, only 1 in 5 Twitter accounts has ever posted anything, and 90% of the content is posted by just 10% of the users. So the question is, yes, we all kind of get it, and we think we'd like to do it in our organisation, but if you took those stats and put them into your organisation, only half of the people use it, and only 10% of the people actually put any content there, would that work? Would you get good business value out of those kind of adoption statistics? Maybe you would, don't know. In terms of the adoption of this technology, the S-curve is, you know, something that's being used to track the adoption of different technologies, from postage stamps to seeds and all sorts of things. And as you can see, roughly here, this is from McKinsey Quarterly, around about 2009, we're probably somewhere around about here, which really supports the sort of like the Gartner view on the hype cycle. So just starting really in terms of the mainstream adoption, but importantly you can see that that's actually got the productivity up the side. So lots of hype, not much productivity. This came from a client that I worked with in 2009, so the site statistics are actually out. I've called them Client X to protect the innocents. They're a global organisation which accounts for some of these numbers. But they went out and they researched themselves how many times they could find themselves on social networking and social media sites. And you can see the numbers up there. On YouTube, they found over 1,000 videos that had got something to do with their company that people were just posting up there. You can see the number of Facebook groups, 500, 470 events, 70,000 current employees had got LinkedIn profiles, You can see the numbers. 918 tweets in the last 7 days. I've sat in meetings with smaller organisations, and whilst I'm talking to somebody, we're not in a Microsoft conference, it's okay, I actually Google, if I was at Microsoft I'd Bing of course, but I actually Google the company's name, and often the company website comes up first, but then you'll start to find all of this user-generated content. So it's happening out there in the world anyway. The trick really is to get a handle on it. I went to see an organisation that sells advertising for local newspapers in the UK. And the IT manager was absolutely tearing his hair out because he just discovered that his salespeople dotted around the UK had created a public Facebook group and were writing sensitive price information on the wall in Facebook because the internal IT systems weren't fluid and dynamic enough for the kind of communication that they wanted. So they switched it over onto a public platform. So maybe that's a good reason to start thinking about why you should be getting hold of this. Analysts predict lots of things. So apparently by 2014, 20% of people will be using social networking rather than email. Okay, so here's one. So by next year, these are a year old now, by next year 50% of enterprises will use activity streams that include microblogging. Who's doing that? Okay, so that looks like about 1% or 2%, so the rest of us had better get on with it or else Gartner will be proved wrong. You see this sort of thing? I mean, I'm trying to cut through some of the hype here. So through 2012, 70% of IT-dominated projects, social media initiatives will fail. Doesn't really matter because the stats show that 70% of IT projects fail anyway. And there's seriously, and there's research going back to 1996 from a company called the Standish Group, and they actually every year. So I won't go into that. That's a slightly different presentation. But, you know, you get these kind of headlines, it's all terrible, and then actually, no, that's just the way that the world works. So don't get carried away by the hype. Into all of this, of course, we can't not talk about SharePoint Best Practices Conference. So along comes SharePoint 2010. Has anybody not seen SharePoint 2010 My Site features? Okay, so most people, the odd one or two that haven't. Basically, most of the functionality, not all, but most of the functionality that you get on the public platforms like Facebook and LinkedIn, not Twitter yet, but Facebook and LinkedIn, have started to make an appearance in SharePoint 2010. So most of you are familiar with these. I won't go through them all. The ones in bold are the ones that are new in SharePoint 2010. My Site actually appeared in SharePoint 2003, of course, before Facebook ever really hit the shelves. Something possibly new, Microsoft are working on something called Office Talk. This is taken from Microsoft Office Labs. They're using this themselves. I've seen it deployed in a small way on their internal intranet. And as far as I can make out from reading the lab reports, it's basically a kind of a Twitter or a Yammer type enterprise feed inside the organisation. So they haven't said that they're going to release it. It's out there with a few organisations at the moment for testing. But I think the point is that there is still a very strong focus from Microsoft on making SharePoint more and more social. So it's not going away anytime soon. So hurrah, with all of this new functionality, it rockets SharePoint up to the front of the social software in the workplace market, up there in the leaders quadrant. So you've got a market-leading product. Everybody out there in their social lives and in their personal lives are using this type of technology. The analysts are screaming at you, you've got to do it, you've got to do it. But what actually, as I said earlier, you're trying to do, and how will you know when you've done it? There are, of course, some risks associated with this. So UK people will recognise some of this. Excuse the deleted expletive here, but this is a young man who was playing for the under-international cricket team in England, and after being dropped from the cricket team, this was the tweet that he put out. John Abrahams was the selector. So he got dropped by his county. So, you know, very quickly, what's the phrase they're using at the moment? Loose tweets sink fleets, apparently, is the latest phrase. This was something from 2009. Twitter cost businesses 1.4 billion. It's all terrible. Ban it, quick. Of course, you know, then you get into the about, well, you know, do you ban the water cooler? Do you take people's telephones off each other? You know, do you stop people talking in the corridor? So the argument here is people are wasting time at work, not being productive because they're tweeting. I actually found out that SharePoint 2010 had been released to the market. Don't know whether I want to admit this, because I'm a fan of SharePoint on Facebook. So I got up on a Sunday morning, turned Facebook on, and there it was, SharePoint 2010 as RTM. This is an interesting one. This is to do with inappropriate use. So Waterloo Station, for those of you not from London or the UK, Waterloo Station is a main train station in London, and there's a cafe bar called the Slow Bar. So I was sat in there a few weeks ago doing a conference call with a client, And I actually tweeted just before the conference call, sat in the Slow Bar Cafe at Waterloo Station, doing the conference call. I get up the next morning, and on Twitter, Slow Bar Toilet is following you. So I was like, well, what's that? And what it is at Waterloo, to use the convenience, you have to pay 30 pence. And of course, there's a bar with a toilet, they have to have it for the customers, yeah? But there's a code on the door to stop non-customers from using it and saving themselves the 30 pence. So some enterprising individual has set up a Twitter account, and when you know what the code is for the door that day, you tweet it, and then everybody using Waterloo Station can save themselves 30 pence. So I decided that I wasn't too keen on being followed by a toilet, so I blocked them from my account. The person's not in the room by any strange coincidence. No? But okay, so if you don't have 30p, but you do have your mobile, you're away. This is where I lose brownie points. I am a Man United fan, so I found this quite amusing. So Man United playing Liverpool, referee awards a dubious penalty. Man United win the game. Liverpool knocked out the FA Cup. Along comes one of the Liverpool players, does a mock-up of the referee wearing a Man United shirt and posts it on Twitter. And of course he gets hauled over the coals by the sports governing bodies. And then of course Charlie Sheen. So he's obviously become famous. He's broken world records for going from, what's the number here? From Twitter virgin to 1 million followers in under 2.5 days. I believe he threatened to cut off his mother-in-law's head and then stood on a building waving a sword around. So, well, we've all done it, exactly. Who doesn't do that on a Saturday night? Okay, so that's the background. Okay, so now let's kind of dive in. And I have to be honest, when I sent in the submission for this session, I sent Steve Smith a whole load of titles. And he picked on one that I'd got no content for, which was this one. He said, oh, that looks good, do that one. So I started researching, and actually this is a really difficult subject to get into. Hopefully I've managed to get down to some kind of sense. So this again is a quote that a customer came forward with. It was actually around collaboration rather than social networking, around about 2 or 3 years ago. So question, who thinks that this is a strategic objective? A couple of people, let you time to read it. Now, I used to do business analyst type work, okay? So when I first saw that, I poo-pooed it. I said, that's terrible, that will never go anywhere. And actually it didn't, but that's not the point. But I said, that's terrible, you can't have that. And then I started thinking about it, actually. Is Wes Hackett in the room anywhere? Is he not here today? Ah, there you are. Sorry, Wes.
Yes,
yeah, so when I was watching your session yesterday and you put the vision up from Tesco's, it did make me think. I thought, well, actually, you start with a vision, and maybe that's actually, you don't need to start with a specific strategic objective. So no, it's not a strategic objective, but it is a vision. And with social computing, sometimes you just have to start with a vision. This is very much my view, and if you notice that the reds change on all of these slides, I had terrible trouble with PowerPoint trying to get the same colours. Okay, so this is my view on the different approaches that you can take to doing social computing. Does anybody have a knowledge management program in their organisation? A few people, okay, so maybe about half a dozen or so. So facilitated knowledge management. Knowledge management has been around for, since the mid-1990s. We all started sticking stuff in knowledge bases and then kind of wondered why nobody took it out and it didn't actually, do us any good to have databases full of documents. But it's evolved, and there's some very, very good facilitated knowledge management techniques that have proved to be very good for lots of businesses based on case studies and benchmarks, and we'll have a look at a couple of those in just a moment. Then you've got this idea of ad hoc use of Web 2.0 technologies. So I've created a SharePoint site for whatever it is that I'm creating a SharePoint site for, and I think it might be a good idea to stick a blog on there. Great, fine, as long as it works, that's good. You can use a blog for all sorts of things. That's not really an approach to social computing. That's just, using a tool in the course of a project that you've probably gathered some requirements for, and it's a good old-fashioned IT project. So the ad hoc use of Web 2.0, of Web 2.0 tools. Then you've got this idea of the user-driven philosophy, or Enterprise 2.0, which of course is not actually got that much to do with technology. It's a complete mind shift. It's a change in the way that you, manage your business and that you deal with your employees. So a couple of proven KM approaches, and you'll start to see now how there's a connection with social computing. So expertise location. Okay, so lots of knowledge management companies or organisations that do knowledge management have expertise location systems. People are thinking, oh great, yeah, my site, and people search, and I type in, SharePoint, and up comes Simon's profile because it says SharePoint on his profile. The point is, that with an expertise location system and a knowledge management program, normally it's some central body or some management team within the organisation that decides who is an expert. Okay, not you lot because you all work in the company and you've rated them very highly. The organisation decides who's the expert. They decide who that go-to person is, and the HR policies change, and that expert that gets located is given time to respond to different questions, and maybe they get bonuses, you know, based on how many assists that they do. It's built into the fabric of the organisation. It's not just turning on people search. Then you've got the ideas of communities of practice. This actually got nothing to do with technology at all. This is bringing people together that share a common interest. So I worked at the Bank of England, did a big project there, and they had 6 divisions, and in 2 divisions there were people that looked after or were interested in inflation. One was for the national economy, one was for the global economy. They didn't even know that each other existed. Okay? So of course you can create a SharePoint site or a LinkedIn group or a Facebook group, and effectively that can become a community of practice. But again, there's lots of best practice around communities of practice. If you're going to do it properly, research shows that having community leaders is really, really important. There's a company, I forget the name of them now, but they actually hold annual elections where everybody in the organisation gets to vote for who they want to be the leader of that particular community. Okay? And again, there's lots of formal processes around it. Lessons learned. So this isn't just about, oh, I've got back from a project and I think I'll write a quick blog. This is a formal process as part of your project close down process where you answer the questions, what was supposed to happen, what did happen, why was there a difference? And you build on it and you take that and you put it somewhere and you make it available. Of course, technology can help with all of this, but it's not just about deploying the tools, it's about having the strategy. And then best practice. People say that to me, we want to deploy my sites and people will connect and we'll share best practices. Who says that's the best practice? How do you know you're not sharing worst practices? Just because somebody blogged it and somebody didn't, who says that the thing that the person that blogged was the best practice? Well, in facilitated knowledge management, people are responsible for actually identifying the best practices, validating them, and then making sure that they're shared and making sure that they're applied. It's not just about blogging it and searching for it. So I'll put this on here just to remind me. So this is an organisation that I'm working with. This is just an example. So a global organisation driven by the knowledge management strategy. This is their business systems architecture that they came up with. They don't give a hoot what technology gets used for this, okay? But they came to us. They said, this is our strategy. This is our business systems architecture. We've identified a whole load of business projects that we want to run on the back of putting this architecture together. Now you, ICS, talk to us and tell us what technologies we need to do all of this. Okay, and that was an absolutely great way for them to start. But they've got investments, as you can see here, 400k initial spend and a 1.5 million pound 3-year spend for a global organisation, but to do a knowledge management programme. And if SharePoint turns out to be the right tool for them, I mean, obviously they've got up here, MySpace, My Site, okay, make the connection, SharePoint's got the tools. If SharePoint's the right tool, great. If it's not, they really don't care. Ad hoc use of Web 2.0. This is something we did a few years ago, so SharePoint 2007. Basically, it's an intranet for Universal Music. They did it for marketing purposes. And what they've got is for each one of their 45,000 artists, they've got a SharePoint site. And yes, it sucks in all of the, the artwork and the digital material. But then what they've done is they've actually started to use some social techniques on those sites. So as well as getting access to the official material, basically each one of those sites becomes a community of practice. Everybody who's interested in U2 can join into that site and they can run blogs and post material up there themselves. And the whole idea is that somebody in the UK might post, let's say, a news story about U2, and then somebody in Timbuktu that's trying to be the artist in that area can leverage that piece of material. Okay? So that's kind of ad hoc. They were doing an intranet anyway, and it was a good idea to start bringing those tools on. Then you come to this user-driven philosophy, the Enterprise 2.0. The best way that I can come up to describe this is a little bit old now, but it was a really good way of describing it. So the avalanche of high-quality, I've edited it slightly, content from citizens following July the 7th bombings in London marked a turning point for the BBC, evolving from being a broadcaster to a facilitator of news. So they're no longer sitting there in the centre pumping stuff out. They've got loads of people throwing all sorts of content at them over the internet from mobile phones and all sorts. And they're actually able to reuse that content. So they've had to completely change the way that they think about themselves, a complete mind shift. And this is from the former editor of the BBC Global News. The crowd were not only invading the field, but we're seeking to participate in the game, fundamentally changing the sport. Okay? So if you want to go down this user-driven philosophy enterprise 2.0 road, then your biggest problem is not going to be the technology, it's going to be getting your managers and your leaders of the organisation to make this mind shift and to lead the organisation in that direction. Okay, let's go down these reasonably quickly. So facilitated knowledge management, you can have explicit aims and objectives. We want to shorten the amount of time it takes us to train new hires. We want to shorten the time that it takes us to innovate new products and get them to market. With a user-driven philosophy, it's more about vision, such as the example that Wes gave and the one that I showed earlier from the client. It's about vision, experimentation and monitoring. So have a general idea where you want to go, try something and see what happens. But don't forget, an experiment means that you understand the current situation, you do something, and then you monitor it and see what's changed. It doesn't just mean throw a load of software out there and see what happens. With knowledge management, you get quantifiable business benefits and good old-fashioned ROI. With user-driven philosophy, you have to kind of go more on proxy measures. So it's very difficult to associate particular ROI with using social computing techniques, particularly social networking. So one measure that you can use is, how many blogs have been created, how many comments were there on the blogs, how many sites have been created, how many profiles are kept up to date, those type of things. And you just make the assumption that if behaviour changes, then that produces good results for your organisation. That's one way that you can do it. Knowledge management, the absolute key to knowledge management is based on business processes. But user-driven philosophy is based on viral networks. So again, it's why it's difficult to measure it. Knowledge management, you've got designated experts by the company. We've spoken about this. With the user-driven philosophy, it's emerging experts based on trust and reputation. How many 5-star ratings have you got on your blog and things like that? Knowledge management, you've got 4 processes for identifying, validating and sharing best practices and lessons learned. On the other side of the coin, you've got employee-driven ratings. You've got taxonomy versus folksonomy. A focus on processes, so we're going to enable this business process, versus a focus on capabilities. We're going to put in the hands of the employees the ability to communicate and make connections, recognising that a connection between 2 people is a valuable asset, but you've got less idea what's actually going to happen. So knowledge management is predictable, user-driven philosophy is unpredictable. From centralised top-down to diffused and bottom-up. From costly and resource-intensive to not so costly and not so resource-intensive, but it does still cost. So, business case. I'm not suggesting that you all just walk into the boardroom to your financial director and say, I have a dream, and expect to walk out of there with a nice shiny check for all of your SharePoint licenses. It's still a good idea to take your vision and try and map it up to some sort of business case, even if you can't measure it at the end. So, some headlines that you might be able to use. So, innovation. So if you're creating social networks, you're connecting people, and the idea is for innovation that you recombine existing resources and expertise and try and create something new. So it's difficult to know that because 2 people met, something exciting would happen. Classic example, I was on Facebook yesterday, and there's somebody on there that I haven't seen for 29 years. And on Twitter, which posts through to Facebook, I put having breakfast in the Crowne Plaza, which is the hotel that I'm staying in. By an absolutely astonishing coincidence, this guy, who I haven't seen since I was 11, was having a meeting in the Crowne Plaza. And he saw it come up on Facebook. He said, I'm there. And I walked into the lobby and saw him having his meeting. If I hadn't have known he was there, I'd have walked within inches of the guy. I know really well, although I haven't seen him for a long time, but I'd never known he was there. So who knows what will happen as a result of that. You could potentially shorten your product development life cycles or improve the speed to market. So here's a good example. We're going to go and create a social network and people are going to connect and share things. Great. Who's going to connect? And who's going to share what with who for what purpose? So if you've got a focus on innovation, well, hang on a minute. People talk to customers, salespeople. People understand the market, marketing people. And the people that actually come up with our products or services, let's say it's, the scientists and the R&D people, they don't often go to the pub together. Let's create some sort of connection between these 3 groups of people and facilitate that with technology. Something exciting might happen, and you could measure that. How many patents or new products did we come up with this year compared to last year? But it's not just about the technology. Revenue, so cross-selling. This is a good one. So in a larger organisation, you might have different business units. And if one business unit has won a customer, it can be easier to have a conversation. You know, this is somebody from the other business unit, and you can resell other products to customers that you've already got, rather than going out there trying to win new business all the time, because it's cheaper and more profitable to sell to existing customers. Costs, well, there's quite a lot of ways that you can reduce the costs. So efficient operations through reusing knowledge assets, do a quick status update or send out some sort of message. I need a whatever it is. Says somebody back on your activity feed. Here is one. I did one yesterday. So it saves you having to recreate it, which is the second point. You avoid redundancy, people doing the same thing over and over again. And potentially you get the opportunity in a more informal way to learn from lessons learned. So you might do a status update. Oh, I'm doing a project to do with, you know, I was about to say nuclear power stations, but that's not a good subject at the moment, is it? I'm doing something exciting and complicated on this project. Somebody sees that and they come back and they say, oh, yeah, I did one of those last week. Maybe you need to know about that. Recruitment and retention, there's actually some good stats, and I'll show you a couple in a minute, that shows that it actually does make a difference to have this kind of technology and this kind of capability, rather than the technology, available for people to use. You attract good talent and you'll keep people as well. Improving team performance. This is about collaboration, basically spinning up SharePoint sites so that teams who are working together to deliver something have got the tools that they need to share information and ideas. And then quality, standardization based on best practices. So hopefully if you take those, if you're trying to think, okay, I've got a vision, but I need to actually kind of make it a little bit more concrete, these headlines here should be a good place to start. And hopefully the smaller bullet points there will help as well. Oh, loads of stuff on a slide. Okay, so this is from McKinsey Quarterly. It's from last year. And what they've done is they've interviewed, let me see, there's 2 studies. It's a couple of thousand people, I think. And as you can see, they're looking at results. And the results that they've got on here are actually, a lot of them, quite closely associated with the things that I've just taken you through. And obviously you can see the size of the bars there as to which ones are working the best. Understanding social networks. If you're trying to build a social network, this is taken from a great book called Throwing Sheep in the Boardroom, which is a very facetious title, but a very good book. Strongly recommend it. And they're talking, the whole book is based on the identity state as power. And I've tried to summarize the whole book really into just a couple of points. So understanding why people join social networks and what kind of keeps them there. So you've got this idea of identity or personal brand. Now, of course, on the internet, you know, you might actually be called Sarah and be a 12-year-old girl, but you could create yourself an identity and you're Dave and a 40-year-old guy. You know, you don't have to be the person that you appear to be on the internet. Of course, inside the firewall, you probably don't have any young girls working for you, and you probably actually want to be the person that you are. But it's about personal brand. So I've had some long, long conversations with people who companies who say things like, should we allow employees to upload their own photographs onto a profile? Yeah? Now, for years, I went around going, you've got to trust your employees. Of course you can let that happen. And then one day I was doing a session like this, and somebody came along and went, Simon. I said, yes. And she said, I did that, she said, and one person put a photograph of themselves wearing a balaclava. She said, and somebody else put a photograph of themselves wearing a Second World War German uniform on there. So she said, absolutely. But just for the sake of 2 people, you can't then distrust everybody else in the organisation. So the identity, of course, is also based around the expertise and the role. What's my job? What do I know about? Status. So X-factor culture. Everybody wants to be famous, of course. So it's about who do you know. So I've connected to, you know, the MD or the CEO. And there's the ratings. So I've got 5-star ratings for all of my blog entries. So, you know, I must be good at what I do. I'm famous. You've got this idea of social capital and reputation. The difficult thing, remember that John Abrahams thing that we saw where he was swearing? The trouble with social computing and social networking is because it's so instant, you can destroy a reputation in a matter of seconds that took you a long, long time to build up. Power, so shifts things in an organisation. So cult of the amateur. I read something that was written in 1951. I think they were talking about television, actually. But they were basically making all of the same arguments, that because people can publish content these days, actually the quality of the content drops. and you've got this idea that everybody's an amateur, but everybody's producing content, so it's not good. So the same arguments have been made every time there's a leap forward in communication technology. And this is an interesting one to keep in mind if you're trying to build either communities of practice, potentially, or wider social networks. Exit, voice, and loyalty. So this is a piece of research that goes back many years about how people deal with being in social groups. And basically, the idea is, if they're not happy, they've got two choices. They can either exit, I'm leaving the group, or they can voice their concerns, organise some sort of protest group or something like that. But the key trick here is if you actually listen to people and then act on the concerns that they raise, what that does is that earns you loyalty and trust, and people then stay with the community or the network that you've tried to create. Where to start? This was something that caught my attention. So what we've got here is, this is around about 2,500 organisations. And what they've done is, the interesting bit is actually across the top there. So they've classified people or organisations in their survey as being developing their use of what they're calling Web 2.0 tools. And then they've got internally networked, externally networked, and fully networked. And you can see by the numbers at the top that actually, of the organisations they surveyed, 76% of them were actually still in this developing. So we're going back to the adoption curve now, looking at how many people are actually doing this. But people are starting to actually report benefits. So that's maybe a good way of putting together your own business case as well. Look at secondary research, look at what people have done, and feed it into your own business case. Some strategy best practices. I've pretty much talked through them all, so I'll leave these for you to read through when you get the slide deck. I'll just pull one out off here. This, I think, is maybe the key point, and that's when it comes to social computing, it's your management and HR management that's going to be more of a problem than the actual technology. The technology is rushing off into the future, but actual people management techniques are still in the 1990s. Things like, are people in your organisation allowed to work at home? Do you measure people on inputs or do you measure people on outputs? Who bans Facebook at the firewall in their organisation? It's about 70% of organisations on the last stats that I saw. That's still quite a lot. Okay, so if you're in an organisation where you ban Facebook at the firewall, walking into the boardroom with the "I have a dream" speech might be falling on deaf ears. So you need to understand the context you're working in. Governance. This is really short because this isn't social computing specific. This is taken from the work that I do around SharePoint generally. So in my experience of talking, everybody, governance, governance, governance. My first point to make, I only know two people in the world that agree with me, and one of them's me. The other one's a guy called Craig Roth, who works for the Burton Group. Everything Microsoft tells you about governance with SharePoint, garbage. Not because it's wrong, but because it's not governance. Everything that Microsoft tells you about governance is actually IT operations. Governance has got absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with technology. Governance in organisations is about, I'm a shareholder or a supplier of finance, and I give it to the people that run the business. Governance is about making sure that you give me a return and that you're accountable for that return. IT governance is about making sure that when the board of directors give the IT budget to the IT function, they get a return on that. SharePoint governance is about somebody saying, I'm accountable for making sure that the money invested in SharePoint does the business some good. So it's about accountability, nothing to do with technology. The headlines here, I really do need to fly through this. The headlines here are basically, we often see centralised ownership. Either the IT department because we own the tin, so we own SharePoint, or the HR or marketing department because they own the content that's on SharePoint. Okay, that doesn't really work when you want to start to scale up your SharePoint implementation. The minimum starting point is this collaborative steering committee, so where you've got around about 6 or 8 people that represent the different functions in the business. Only one IT person on that committee is the rule. This is something that I prefer to look at. You could go with just a single committee, but this is really, you need to think of these 3 levels. Whoever's running SharePoint or social computing or knowledge management or even a Prince2 project, it applies across the board. Somebody needs to be responsible for the vision and strategy. Somebody needs to be responsible for actually getting out there in the business, promoting the technology, mapping it to the way that the business works, and of course, not forgotten, the guys and girls that run the IT team. I'm not going to labour on this particularly because, as I say, it's not really social computing specific. So the governance best practices, remember it's got nothing to do with IT whatsoever. The IT department absolutely can't make a success of enterprise social computing on their own. You can put those tools out there, you'll have 1,000 unused my sites like the bank that I was talking about at the start. Really, you need to involve HR and internal comms and marketing. They are so important in driving these types of initiatives. And you need executive support, preferably from outside of the IT function. If you can get somebody like your head of HR, head of communications, to stand up on a table in the canteen, figuratively speaking, and say, I am accountable for this investment, this social computing strategy, actually, then you're on a winner, okay? Because they will provide the leadership that you need in the organisation. Architecture, this is a relatively short section as well. Oh, big diagram. Okay, so the key point here is, great, okay, so social computing, I've got a vision, but at the end of the day, I've also got some service that I need to deploy and some software that I need to build. What does this look like? How do I make it work? And what about information architecture? What happens with that? Information architecture, conceptual architecture, which is the way the users see the thing, logical architecture, the way the software is configured, and yes, there's some tin under the bonnet as well. So the key is deploying SharePoint as a set of services, okay? And there's a couple of variations on a theme here. This is how Microsoft have done their internal deployment. So every organisation will be different, but I've put the kind of the headlines here. I'll come back to my site in a moment. So the Teams service is a page on the intranet that I can go to and I can go for SharePoint Teams site, and then the people that I'm working with, we can all use it, and then after a while it gets deleted. It's a service because it's got a service description around it. I've got a certain quota. The fact that I can create it myself, there's certain things that I can keep in there, and if I don't use it for a particular amount of time, it will get deleted. And when it does get deleted, it really does get deleted. It's not archived. So these are things I know about the service, and I choose to use it. Okay? If you go to Facebook, you've never been there before, you can click on create yourself a profile, and then when you've got your SharePoint, when you've got your Facebook profile, you can do things with it. Facebook is a service, okay? Social networking service. Then you've got the idea of communities. Now, communities are slightly different from teams because these are the communities of practice that I was talking about earlier. So maybe in this case, you can't create one instantly. Maybe there's some sort of info path form that you have to fill in, and you have to request that a community is created for you. And if the community is created for you, you have certain responsibilities because you are the community leader. And the fact that you've created it and you are a community leader means that you are given time by your boss. Maybe your boss has to sign off the fact that you can be a community leader because it will take a certain amount of time. But again, it's a service that you can use. Portals, this is the traditional publishing intranet being flattened and broken down. So rather than having a home page and then an HR page and a UK page, or is it UK and then HR, which way up does it go? Forget all of that now, and even when you have worked it out, it will all have changed anyway. So the idea here is that you actually probably have a separate web application for every portal. So at Microsoft, for instance, they have HR Web or HR UK Web or Finance Web or Academy, and they're all effectively different websites. Applications is a bit of a catch-all. We need to do some customization to support a business process, and it doesn't really fit any of these. So we've got a service where you can come to the IT department and we'll analyse your requirements and build something particular for you. Projects has a lot of formal projects with budgets and authority to proceed. You might have a project management type service or a PMO service, and maybe one for an extranet. You'll get variations on the theme. So now I'll come back to my site. So you could implement a social networking service where every user has the option of creating their own My Site and then going off and doing some social networking. The question is, if all of this is your intranet, where's your home page? Now, there's two kind of answers to this, really. So Microsoft, for instance, who incidentally haven't rolled out My Site 2010 in the UK yet, because they're struggling with it in terms of various adoption issues. It's gone well in the States, but they haven't rolled it out themselves. They use search as their home page, okay? And the question is, what's the first page you go to when you go on the internet? Probably, don't say the G word, it's probably going to be a search engine. it's not a search engine, then probably the other thing that you might go to is your Facebook or your LinkedIn wall. And this is something that Wes was talking about, that he'd worked with one of his clients, and they used My Site activity feeds as the homepage. So that's your other option. Okay, either My Site can be your homepage and you can aggregate all of your content there, or you could just make My Site a social networking service, social computing service, and have potentially search as a homepage. People choose what they want themselves. I said I wasn't very technical. I've used Balsamiq to mock this. Would you believe, and I hope that you would, that Microsoft have got a page? This isn't a homepage. This is just a page on the Microsoft intranet. Okay, Microsoft have got a page that looks pretty much exactly like that. No more branding on it than that. And this is how services appear to the user. Do you want to create a team site? Click there, choose a template, bang, you've got it in 30 seconds. Want to create a My Site? Same sort of thing. Bang, it's there in a few seconds. Portals, though, that goes through an approval process. And I think you have to be a business leader to have a portal created for you. And communities is the communities of practice. So just trying to take that concept diagram that I've shown you and showing you how it might actually appear to the users. So architecture best practices, just one more to go. Deploy SharePoint as a set of services. And as far as the social computing is concerned, My Site, potentially, would be one of those services. Each service has a brand, so don't call My Site, My Site. Come up with some exciting name for it. Run a competition. Sounds cheesy, but it works. Okay, run a competition. Come up with a logo for it. That's really important because what it does is it positions the tool, the service, in the minds of the user as being for a particular purpose. Okay, so develop a brand. That's top tip. Add breadth and depth to the service. So you put out your vanilla service, and then you can either start to add more functionality to that service over time, or you can go wide and add new services on. So from social computing to teams to communities of practice, for instance. And as I mentioned earlier, either search or My Site activity feed as the homepage, if you need a homepage. Final bit, transition. So transition is a term that we use to cover two main things: change management and user adoption. So the change management, we're really talking about organisational change. So maybe changing processes, maybe changing the way that roles interact with each other, that type of thing. And the user adoption is much more focused down at the individual level. Another way of thinking about it is this is culture, this is behaviour. Because you can change the culture, that's fine, but unless you change individual specific behaviour to get them to use the tools that you give them in a way which is conducive to the objectives that you have, you're going to get nowhere. Just one slide on change management. Change management is a structured approach to transitioning teams and organisations from a current state to a desired future state. Key point, structured. So even if, we've not done this before, we're trying to plan it, at least we've got a plan, okay? Even if it only fits on one side of A4. Current state, you understand what the current state is. So if you're trying to create social networks, have a look what social networks actually exist in your organisation at the moment, okay? And then maybe either try and facilitate those further, or think, oh, actually, hang on a minute, look for the ones that don't exist and try and fill the gaps. To a desired future state. There's no point, honestly, I mean, it might work for some organisations, there's no one size fits all, but fire and forget with the technology, bang, everybody's got a My Site, on to the next project. That's probably not going to take you very far. There's whole loads of reams of stuff you can read about change management, but basically, I think his name was Carl Lewin, 1960s, came up with this model, and it's basically incremental change. And the phrase that he uses is take the organisational state, unfreeze by letting people know that there is a problem and there's a solution coming, transition them to the new way of doing things, and then baseline again so that that becomes the norm. And you get this incremental steps. That then impacts on the way that you approach rolling out your social computing functionality. So you do these in any particular order. I've just picked on this kind of randomly. So the first one is your project to deliver teams. And in this model, I've gone for breadth. So I've gone a different service with every iteration of the project. But equally, you might say it's Teams, Teams version 2, Teams version 3, Teams version 4. If you decide that getting groups of people to work together is what's actually most conducive to your business goals. So, iterative development or prototyping. Oh, God, there's loads on there. This is really important, okay? Barriers to collaboration. So the 4 at the top are the main barriers to collaboration. Okay? Hoarding, people are unwilling to share what they know. Not inventing here, people not willing to go outside of their organisational unit or team. A search problem and a transfer problem. Okay? Now, on this, these are the kind of, the second line here are the things that make up the top one. So these kind of aggregate up into the top one. Modern management, it's been said, is the absolute nemesis of collaboration. If you want, not teams to work together necessarily, but if you want your organisation to collaborate at the business unit level, and you think, oh, we'll come up with a social network and everybody will collaborate, ask where the P&Ls are, profit and loss. Because if your UK operation's got its own profit and loss, and your French operation's got its own profit and loss, do you think that they're going to collaborate willingly? Probably not, because everybody's focused on their own incentives. So that would be a difficult one that probably no social network is really going to solve, no matter how cool your my site is. Okay? Narrow incentives. So I actually get rewarded as an individual for doing my job. I don't get rewarded as an individual for doing your job or helping you do your job. So I don't care how cool your my site is or how good the activity feed is. I'm doing my job first. Too busy. Talk to the hand. Fear, loss of knowledge. I'm not going to tell you this because my whole sort of, reputation is wrapped up with the fact that I know this. Knowledge is power. We know that one. Insular culture. Communications mainly inside a group. Status gap. This is quite interesting. The research is, you might think that if you get sort of, people, lowly people, and offer them the opportunity to mix with highfalutin important people, that they would want to take it. No, they don't. People like to stay in their own groups. The phrase that I heard was, people like to stay in their own pond. Okay, because they might feel that, maybe people were looking down on them, or they would feel inferior if they went off to this other group. So it works both ways. People like to stay inside their own groups. Don't want to go and ask my boss or this important expert who's been in the company for 50 years to help me with my problem because I'm a newbie and, what would he or she want to talk to me for? Self-reliance, oh, I'm weak, I've said that I've got a problem, I've asked for help, I'm a terrible person. It's the culture of the organisation, and the similar things with the fear. Now, the funny thing is that these 2 blocks here, you're not going to solve that with technology. No way. You're going to solve that through your HR policies, through your change management, through training, through leadership. These ones you can start to solve with technology. So search problem, which comes from the company's too big, great, enterprise search. Distance, great, enterprise search. Overload, too much information, oh dear, enterprise search. I suppose it depends how good your enterprise search is. And poverty of network. So absolutely, social computing can help with that. You start to put links together, people and start to find things. This is an interesting one as well, though, the transfer problem. So people unable to transfer knowledge. Tacit knowledge, that stuff in people's heads that's based on experience, is actually really, really difficult to transfer. So you'll hear lots of social computing evangelists talking about the strength of weak ties. And they'll say, when you're looking for a job, you don't get a job off the people you know well, you get a job off people you haven't met for years. I must get hold of that guy that I spoke to in the hotel the other day. But, you go out there onto your network on LinkedIn and, you find somebody, an acquaintance rather than a friend, and that's how you get things done. But in an organisation, weak ties are no good for transferring tacit knowledge. If you want to transfer tacit knowledge, you need strong ties. You need to know people well. So you actually need to bring people together so they have, a common framework and they know how to work together. So key point off this slide is if you really do want people to share and collaborate, you should probably have a look at this and see which of these you recognise in your organisation. And as I said, there's a lot of those you won't solve with technology. Don't worry about the horrible slide. This is taken from a Microsoft slide deck. Microsoft use this with their top 100 global accounts where they're trying to drive adoption, particularly around collaboration, but also around social computing. And what they've got, the point is they've got a whole load of different adoption techniques. Okay, now I know you can't read all of this. There's nothing particularly clever in here, but they've gathered them all together. So lunch and learn, executive blog, early adopter video, little techniques for driving adoption and demand. So there's lots of adoption measures, but you need to put them together into a strategy. And again, this is the way that Microsoft put theirs together, and we do something very similar. So you're talking about awareness, availability, usage and adoption as the different phases of your plan to drive your new social computing initiative or your new collaboration project or your communities of practice. And this is actually based on work that we did with the Bank of England, and I'll come on to the results that it got in just a moment. So they actually came up with pens for their collaboration service. Collaborators Do It Online was the pen that they came up with, which actually in the bank was really risque because the bank's, 300-year-old organisation with a very conservative culture. So having, do it online, oof. Anyway, so they came up with posters and they put bulletins out on the intranet. And the whole point of this is you're letting people know that there is a problem and that something is coming along to solve the problem. So awareness of the problem and the solution. Then the thing becomes available, so you can use prototypes and pilots to, get users involved in the design process, launch day events, hurrah, big presentation in the auditorium or something, and then actually have people working. If you're going to roll something out across the organisation, maybe you're going to go for different sections of the organisation, have people, ask me for help. Like the girls downstairs, can I help T-shirts? Get people walking around if it fits with the culture, okay? Get them walking around in the office, collaborate, can I help? Social computing, can I help? Usage, so easy first steps. Imagine you were rolling out a My Site service, okay? So the idea of easy first steps is you hand out or you communicate a very short series of actions that people go through. And the idea is click here, click there, enter this, enter that, and at the end of it, hurrah, you've done something wonderful. The point is that your first experience of this thing is positive. And again, there's lots of good research that shows that if somebody has a positive experience the first time they do something, that's good, and you'll probably keep them. If they have a bad experience, you'll probably lose them and you'll find it difficult to get them back. So the easy first steps is really important. Closely associated with that is sandpits. So with the Bank of England, when they created their collaboration solution, they created a complete copy of the collaboration solution, and any user could go onto that Collaborate site, mess about, make as much mess as they wanted, big mark across it, do not use for anything real. Try before you buy, okay? People trying something out. And then for the adoption, once it's actually, gone into business as usual, support desk service updates, include it in your employee orientation, things like that. Almost there. And of course, you would have a plan. You would put it into some sort of timescales as well. Again, this is something taken from Microsoft. The point I'm trying to get across here is there is a structured approach to using specific adoption techniques across, a particular way of phasing them out. So, almost there. So, at the Bank of England, we did this project, we started in 2009, so it's built on SharePoint 2007. We did about 9 months of work with them and then disengaged with them. The key point here is that they got a dedicated team of around about 4 or 5 people, not the technical team, but a dedicated team of people that were running this collaboration service. I went back to see them after 6 months and they were like, you're right, Simon. I said, it's not going well, is it? They went, well, it's all right. They're monitoring the success. It's all right. It's not really got us where we want to be. Went back to see them 2 weeks ago, so 9 months after we'd left them, and after 9 months, these were the results that they got. So they were measuring site visits. They went from 0 to 160,000 site visits from 2,500 employees, and that's per month, 160,000 site visits per month to their collaboration sites. 50% approximately of the employees at the bank had volunteered to go on the optional training course, not a SharePoint training course, but a half-day training course about how to use the particular collaboration service that they'd come up with. The Governor of the Bank of England names the project as one of the 2 most successful projects in 2010 in his end-of-year address to all of the bank staff. He actually asked to meet all of the project team from the bank, but my invitation must have got lost in the post. The project manager at the bank said to me on the phone, she said it's the most successful project that she's ever worked in at the bank, and she's been there for, I think, about 15 years. And in January this year, the bank do what they call BIBs, Business Improvement Bonuses, and they gave 5 of 15 awards in January for use of the collaboration site, of the collaboration service that improved the business. So some transition best practices. Have an explicit plan. You know the old saying, 10% tools, 90% people? Yeah? Look at your project plan when you're doing your collaboration, your social computing, your My Site initiative, and just have a look. Is the technology 10% and 90% of your budget is allocated to adoption techniques? Because if it's not, then, you know, if we go, oh yeah, 10% tools, 90% people, but actually we'll put the budget to 99% tools and 1% project management and no people. Okay, so it's no wonder that things fail. Try and be clear about the problem and the solution. People need to understand both the corporate return on investment and the personal return on investment. What's in it for me? You can read the rest of these through for yourself, but I guess the key one that I'll pick out is remember that change takes time. To get the bank to use this collaboration solution took them 9 months with a dedicated team of people in there working on it. That's it from me. I like you. I hope that you've liked this. I haven't left any time for questions, but feel free to come up and talk to me or ask me any questions or tweet away. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.